My topic is the Rebbetzin. First of all, that's quite a topic. And second of all, I'm one of those old-fashioned people who thinks that a woman should talk about the Rebbetzin rather than a man. I really do believe that. But here I am, talking about the Rebbetzin. I have my notes. I prepared this speech. I wrote a bunch of details about her life that we know. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm standing here, and as I was preparing, I thought the same thing. That this is not supposed to be a history lesson. I'm not here to talk about the Rebbetzin because she was an important person and we need to know the story of her life. B'chlal, Yidden are not historians. History is a field that in and of itself has no life. History is only useful if it teaches something. In other words, history is only useful if history isn't history, if it's current. And certainly to talk about the Rebbetzin, it needs to be more than just a nice story about a wonderful lady who none of us knew. So I hope that this will be the point. I hope that we don't walk away from hearing some nice stories saying, wow, she was a really nice lady, she was really sweet and nice and smart and kind, all the other things that people say about the Rebbetzin, but that we'll get something which is really who the Rebbetzin was and is, that has to do with ourselves and with our future and with our practical lives and decisions we make. Because as underwhelming and as secret as the Rebbetzin was, she lived like the Rebbe. So we should be a little bit better, really, push it, better as Yidden, servants of the Eibishter. And we, none of us mind hearing stories, but most of us mind being told that we should change who we are. And that's really what this is about, honestly. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin are not about us liking them and liking ourselves. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin are about us respecting them and growing, changing ourselves. And I think this is very critical when you talk about the Rebbetzins life, because all we have are anecdotes, all we have are stories. The Rebbetzin didn't say do this or do that. She never told anybody to do anything. So it's important that the goal, the end, should be that we learn a lesson that will change us in some way. So let me begin with this. The Rebbe made the Rebbetzin a Rebbetzin. In my opinion, I don't think it's only my opinion, I think it's a fact, the Rebbetzin did not want to be a Rebbetzin. The Rebbetzin would say repeatedly, I'm married to a Rebbe, but I'm not a Rebbetzin. It's his job, it's not my job. He accepted his half of the responsibility, I'm not accepting my half of the responsibility. The Rebbetzin did not see herself as a Rebbetzin in a public way, certainly not. And the Rebbe, of course, honored that. The Rebbetzin became a Rebbetzin for most Lubavitcher Chassidim after she passed away. There were those who knew her, no question about it. And they're the ones who share the story of their relationships with us and reveal the mystery that was the Rebbetzin Chaya and Mushka. But the Rebbe made her a Rebbetzin. The Rebbe wanted the Rebbetzin to be a public person. The Rebbe wanted that we should talk about her. The Rebbe wanted that we should have her picture in our home. Because the Rebbe wanted that she should be an influence in our lives. And all of this the Rebbe started after the Rebbetzin passed away. During her physical lifetime, the Rebbe didn't talk about her either. When the Rebbetzin passed away, the Rebbe began to talk about her a lot, an awful lot. The Rebbe made campaigns. The Rebbe made fabrengens. The Rebbe spoke siches. The Rebbe gave out maimorim for her schus and to inspire us to have a relationship with her. Just to give you several anecdotes to support this. The first is the Rebbetzin passed away Tuesday night to a Wednesday when Shevat was Wednesday that year. The Rebbetzin passed away late Tuesday night. After midnight, the Rebbetzin passed away. Her guf Kodesh was brought back to the Rebbe's house. The Tahara was done in the house. The Levaya left from the Rebbe's house. I think it was in the morning. I don't think it was noon. The Rebbe, I remember the Oren coming down the steps. The Rebbe following behind the Oren on President Street. They walked all the way till 770. It was hard for the Rebbe to walk. And then they went to the Beis HaChaim, and the Rebbe came back, and he sat Shiva in his house. So Chav Beis Shvat was Wednesday. Gershon Ber Jacobson, the father of the famous Jacobsons, had a newspaper which still exists called the Allgemeine Journal, which then was more Yiddish than English. Now it's a combination of Yiddish and English. And he printed for that Shabbos 3 pictures of the Rebbetzin. In other words, within a day, the newspaper came out for Shabbos. This was Wednesday. By Thursday, he had already written an article, found space in his paper, wrote about the Rebetzin's life, described the Levaya, and printed several pictures of her. And the Rebbe thanked him, which was a big surprise to us, because we knew how private the Rebbetzin had been, and we felt that this was a violation of her privacy. And the Rebbe said, thank you. The Rebbe thanked him for publishing her pictures. And as time would show, the Rebbe would repeatedly encourage people to include the Rebbetzin in their lives by having her picture and telling her stories, because the Rebbe, like I said, the Rebbe wanted the Rebbetzin to be our Rebbetzin. And the Rebbetzin that she was not able to be during her physical lifetime, for reasons that only she knew, the Rebbe made her a Rebbetzin posthumously after she passed away. There's no doubt in my mind. There is a fascinating note, written to a very, very big Rav named Harav Gavriel Tziner. Gavriel Tziner is a Hasidic Rav. He's originally a proper Chassid, not Chabad. He became close to the Rebbe when his Rebbe, who must have been a real Gadol, passed away. And he had a very special relationship with the Rebbe. He would ask the Rebbe all kinds of questions, and the Rebbe would answer questions that he asked that most other people, the Rebbe wouldn't answer. And he wrote the Rebbe a note after the Rebbe passed away, protesting the fact that her picture was printed, especially a color picture. And he wrote to the Rebbe that he felt it was wrong, and he actually finishes the letter with the words, it was rude of him to tell the Rebbe that he thinks that it was a mistake to publish the Rebbetzin's picture, and he could finish the letter by saying, fortunate of the generation where the great ones can tolerate listening to the little ones when the little ones are right. So this letter that he wrote to the Rebbe doctored. He took his pen and began to move the words around, using arrows and circles, crossing out certain words, adding certain words, and draws the opposite conclusion from his words, from his Yerideh, from his Shulchan Aruch, of the laws of Tznius, and says, nope, based on the sources you're citing, when you look at them this way, the conclusion is, you should have a picture of the Rebbe. The Rebbe does mention, by the way, that in the second print of that pamphlet that he references, they took out the color picture and left only black and white photographs. There's a difference between a color and a black and white, apparently in halacha. And the Rebbe writes to him that the reason why people are disseminating a photograph, the Rebbe uses the Lashon, the Moisifim, is because it increases in the V'achai Yitin Alibay. When the Rebbetzin passed away, the slogan that the Rebbe invoked, and he used it a whole year, V'achai Yitin Alibay, the living will take the heart. And of course, part of the reason the Rebbe used that expression is because the Rebbe's name was Chaya, so it was a Lashon, Neifel HaLashon. V'achai Yitin Alibay, the living will take the heart. And when you read this note to Rabbi Tziner, it becomes very clear, at least to me, that the Rebbe was saying, it's good. There should be a picture of the Rebbetzin in your home. You should talk about the Rebbetzin. The Rebbe wanted us to learn from her life and from her example. And for this reason, we have to talk about her. I hear from people who object and they feel that it's wrong and so on and so forth. The basis, I really believe this, that after she passed away, the Rebbe said, now is the time to celebrate her life, to talk about her, to bring her into our world, because we need her. We need the Rebbetzin. So we're going to talk about her for whatever time we have. The Rebbetzin was royalty. She was. Now we say that word and don't think anything of it. It's cool, right? It's cool to be royalty. Guess what? It's not cool at all. It's an enormous burden. When you think of the Rebbetzin as royalty, you think about how smart she was, how sharp she was, how beautiful she was. You forget the responsibility. Royalty is an enormous, enormous responsibility. And it also expects a lot of you. We never think in those terms. Those of you who are children of shluchim in a Chabad house understand in a Ze'er Ampim what that means. From a very young age, you had to behave a certain way, not because of who you were, but because of who your parents were. And that's not comfortable. And I'm sure there's a lot of girls who are shluchim in this room, so you know what I'm talking about. But multiply that times 1,000,000, that's how the Rebbetzin grew up. She was the granddaughter of a Rebbe, she was the daughter of a Rebbe, she was the wife of a Rebbe. On one level that means that she was somehow not entitled to a private life. which is, as you would say it, not fair. But there's also the responsibility. A prince, a princess, has to fill that role, and you don't get a contract. When you take a job, you get a contract. You agree to do the job. You don't agree to do a job. A prince and a princess don't sign a contract. They're born into royalty. The Rebbetzin was born into royalty. She was very proud. She felt that she was privileged. But there's also an enormous burden. The burden is that she was, from the moment she was born, a public person. She took that responsibility very seriously. If you speak to people who know her, the Rebbetzin felt that she needed to always look good because of who she was. She didn't like it. The Rebbetzin was a hostess. The Rebbetzin had people coming into her home. Not a million people, but many people. The Rebbetzin worked very hard to anticipate exactly who was coming into her home. If it was children, she prepared things for children. If it was adults, she prepared things for adults. And she would think about what you would like. She felt very responsible as the Rebbetzin, that means as the daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe and as the wife of the Rebbe, to fill the role of a princess and a queen. And from what I understand, it was hard for her. And it would be hard for anybody. Imagine always having to look good. Always having to be your best. It's expected of you because you're the Rebbetzin, right? The Rebbetzin. And this is a little tiny aspect of why the Rebbetzin was so private. Because the Rebbetzin didn't like it. Some people love that. Some people love being a queen and a princess. The Rebbe's mother was a Rebbetzin par excellence. The Rebbe's mother loved the public role. She loved being the Rebbetzin. She loved hosting people. She loved meeting people and greeting people and so on. For the Rebbetzin was a very, very big anstrengung. It was hard for her to do. She did it. And she did it very well. I have a friend of mine, he's quite a bit older than I am, whose mother was a childhood friend of the Rebbetzin. And he remembers going to the Rebbe's house as a child, as a little boy. He never went as a teenager, but a little boy. So I asked him what his recollections. He had no memories. The only thing he says, the Rebbetzin looked beautiful. A little boy. She looked gorgeous, beautiful. It took the Rebbetzin a lot of effort. And she felt obligated to do this as a Rebbetzin. And it was hard for her. It really was hard for her. And at least on a certain level, from what I understand from the people that I've spoken to who were close to her in the house, she didn't like it. She didn't like it. She wished she didn't have to, dress up and make everything perfect because of her role. And it's on some level an explanation, on a very simple level, an explanation for why she was so private. The Rebbetzin also was unbelievably nostalgic. The Rebbetzin left Lubavitch at 15. 15. Now, you're all older than 15, I surmise. Right? 15 is big and little. The Rebbetzin lived 87 years. She always lived in Lubavitch in her head. Lubavitch was Gan Eden. Materially, Lubavitch was a city with no paved roads. Materially, Lubavitch was a place where 8 months a year there was mud on the ground, and you had to walk on planks of wood, so you shouldn't get yourself all fachazet. But her whole life, she remembered Lubavitch. Lubavitch was the world she was comfortable in. Lubavitch was the place where she, if she would have it her way, would have spent her whole life. Lubavitch was a holy world. Lubavitch was a peaceful world. Lubavitch was a very smart world. You know what a smart world means? I'm talking to Americans, yeah? And I'm also an American, so I can explain this to you. A smart world is a world where people say few words and much is understood. A stupid world is where people say many words and little is understood. Get it? The Rebbetzin was that kind of a woman, and she was surrounded by Americans, which means they say a lot that mean little. Everything was an inference. That's how she was raised. You said one word, 2 words, 3 words, it was a whole conversation, and it was understood, and it was clear. This was her world. And people who knew her when she was in her 70s and in her 80s, she was always talking about Lubavitch, and the Bochrim in Lubavitch, and the world of Lubavitch, and the energy of Lubavitch, the holiness of Lubavitch. And again, I want to repeat this a second time. Lubavitch was a different world not because it was physically poor or people was walking in muddy streets, but because it was a world of really, really peaceful, smart people. It was a holy world. Holy worlds are not fires. Holy worlds are deeper worlds. And in a deeper world, like I said to you earlier, people knew when they didn't belong someplace and walked away. In America, you know the old joke about a guy comes home from shul and he says to his wife, today the people in shul gave me a hint. They gave me a hint that I should never come back. She said, yeah, what was the hint? They picked me up and carried me out. The Rebbetzin gave such signals that many people didn't get. She was that kind of a person. That was the generation, it was the world she came from, a world of very, very smart people who in very little said very a lot. And we're totally different than that. And it's part of the generational separation. But her whole life she remembered Lubavitch. The Bachrim, when she, again, I heard this from people, when she talked about the Bachrim, she was describing what it sounded like brothers. The Bachrim were just warriors for the Eibishter. Their whole world was davening and learning in Hasidus, but in this higher way, in this peaceful, not so noisy, conflicted way, but in a very peaceful way. And even though she was only 15, she was actually less than 15, she was 14 and a half. When she left Lubavitch, that was her world. She never forgot it. And it further explains the distance that she felt from us. It was hard for her to relate to us because we were very different. And you want to call good different or bad different, it's different. The Rebbe understood us so well and spoke our language so brilliantly. But the Rebbe was changing himself. The Rebbe was going out of what his world was because the Rebbe was in that kind of a world. We're Americans. What can I tell you? We love ourselves. Thank God. We try at least, okay. The Rebbetzin was also very, very dedicated, very loyal to her family. Her family meant everything to her. And of course, it's not so hard to be loyal to a family like that when your family is holy and wise and kind and generous and alle gute Sachen. But the Rebbetzin was very, very proud of who she was and where she came from. Just to give you a couple of little anecdotes, one of them which I find very interesting is this. The Rebbetzin had the Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbetzins Leichter. The Rebbetzins name was Chaya Mushka. She was the namesake of the Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbetzin, whose name was also Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. As we all know, the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin carry the same names as the Tzemach Tzedek and the Tzemach Tzedek's Rebbetzin. In fact, the Rebbe's father, of Leivik, in his letters to the Rebbe by his chasana, points that out again and again and again. You and your Kala carry the names of the Tzemach Tzedek and his better half or other half. So the Rebbetzin had the Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka's Leichter. The Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, one of her inyanim was that when she benched licht, she didn't want anybody else in the room. There were people in the house, especially in the later years when she needed physical help, but she always arranged that when she benched licht, nobody was in the same room where she was benching licht. So she said this: I don't use my Elter Bubba's Leichter. I don't use the candlesticks from the great grandmother. And her expression was, Wer bin ich, a poshete Yidene, who am I, a simple woman, to use the Leichter of such a wonderful Rebbetzin? But I leg sie weg, I put them down, und ich guck auf sie. I look at them as I bench my own Leichter, und ich feel zugebunden to the Mishpacha. That was what she said. I look at those candles and I feel connected to the family. I have a friend who knew the Rebbetzin personally, who was in the Rebbetzin house a couple of months before the Rebbetzin passed away in the winter of Tafshin Memches, 1988. And he told me the story that they came as a family, the grandparents, the parents, some of the children, to see the Rebbetzin. And the Rebbetzin walked them to the door. And as he was standing by the door, the Zayda says, we didn't sing. The grandchildren had to sing. They had to sing with the Rebbetzin. So one of the little boys sang the Beinani. You know the Beinani, right? The Beinani, and that's how the girls get the tune correctly. I figured that out already. And he sang the Beinani. The Beinani is the feed that was niggin. And he sang, I guess he sang by himself. It was before Bar Mitzvah, I'm assuming. And the Rebbetzin stood and listened. And when he finished, she had tears in her eyes. And he says to her, he told me the story himself, he says to her, this is the niggin of the Friedrich Rebbe. And she says, I know, he was my father. But the I know and he was my father, she wasn't telling it to him because he didn't know. She was telling it to him because of how much it meant to her. And the Rebbetzin was very proud, very connected to her roots, and it meant an awful lot to her. I always ask people the obvious question: what do we know about the Rebbetzin? What do we know about the Rebbetzin? There's really a very simple answer to that question. What do we know about the Rebbetzin? Absolutely nothing. That's the correct answer to the question. The only thing we know is we don't know anything. Because we really, really don't know. But a couple of little details and some stories that reveal different parts of the character. The Rebbetzin was a bardas. How do you describe a bardas? How do you describe a bardas? The only way to describe a bardas is to identify one, and they don't grow on trees. A bardas means a person with depth, with integrity, with responsibility, and with courage. That's for starters, a bardas. A bardas is a person who doesn't say a lot. A bardas always has his eye on the prize, never loses sight of what's important, and gets what has to get done efficiently, quietly, seriously, responsibly, and discreetly. The Rebbetzin was an incredible bardas, and we know a number of anecdotes that reflect this. Number one, I find this amazing. The Friedrich Rebbe in the 20s were living in Russia, we had all of the tzaddis. For whatever reason, the government of Russia put all kinds of punishments on him. One of the many punishments that the Soviet regime put on the Friedrich Rebbe was that he was not allowed to have access to money. Couldn't have a bank account. I don't know the reason, but this was the fact. So the Friedrich Rebbe had to give somebody else the power of attorney. Somebody else had to be legally responsible for his finances, and it was legally registered in the Soviet regime that this person is responsible for Friedrich Rebbe's finances. Who do you think he chose? His daughter. And she was 22 years old. And the Rebbe had a lot of other people to choose. His mother was alive, he had a Rebbetzin, he had Bit Chassidim. The Friedrich Rebbe chose the Rebbe to Chaya Mushka. And you know why he chose the Rebbe to Chaya Mushka? Because he trusted her. And you know why he trusted her? Because the Rebbe understood where this is. The Rebbetzin was so underwhelming. She was so not seen. But the Friedrich Rebbe appreciated that this is a girl that he could trust with matters of life and death. When it comes to finance, he was able to trust her, and that's why he entrusted her with this burden. She managed the Rebbe's money. You probably have heard this from all of your teachers, that about 6 or 7 years ago they published a book of letters from the previous Rebbe to the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. And there's a series of exchanges which is almost funny, where the Friedrich Rebbe writes to the Rebbe, contemplate well the precious pearl that Hashem has given you. And may God Almighty give you chokhmah bina das, to understand completely what the situation is. Be'emes la'amita. This is the Friedrich Rebbe writing to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe writes back to the Friedrich Rebbe, I have no idea what you're talking about. 6 months later, the Rebbe writes him again. Have you yet figured out the special pearl to which I refer? Or do you still not know my riddle? So the Rebbe writes the Friedrich Rebbe a second time, I don't know what you're talking about. So in the third letter, which is a couple months after that, the Rebbe writes, I'm talking about my daughter, your wife. Now it's beautiful, right? The father says to son-in-law, he's such a wonderful girl. But first of all, you're talking about a Rebbe and a Rebbe, not just your father and your chassan to be in a good Hashem. But what the Rebbe should write to the Rebbe, you need chokhmah bina v'das to understand this be'emes v'amite. It gives you an idea that, the basic truth. We don't know anything about this person. She was an incredible bardas. Just to go on, when in Rostov, there was a non-Lubavitch yeshiva called Navardik, in Leningrad, I'm sorry. In other words, during those terrible years in Russia, when all the yeshivas closed and everybody ran for the hills, and the Friedrich Rebbe stood, and Tem Chatmimim stood, there were others who, at least for a time, held their ground. Navardik were very, very erliche, Musaniks, Misnagdim, but very erlich. And there was a Navardik yeshiva in Leningrad. The Rebbetzin would bring them food every day. And it was Mesidas Nefesh Mamash. She had to walk through Leningrad. She probably took a bus or a train to the other side of the city. It's a big city. to bring them food, it had to be done discreetly. And of course, it was easier for a girl to do this than for a man. A man looks, obviously like a frumerid, like an erlecherid. But this is one of the things that the Rebbetzin did. And again, the reason she was given this job is A, she was able to do it, and B, she was able to do it in a kind of way that only a badas can, to do it without being seen. It's a reflection of her muhus. When the Rebbe Rayatz, when the Friedrich Rebbe was sent off into exile after he was let out of jail, he went to Kostrama. He was supposed to go for 3 years, and he spent 10 days. He took his daughter. The Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka went with him, and she was with him when the news came, when the news was announced that he's being let go. She was with him in the room. There was nobody else around. So the way the story is told, she got up and she sang and she danced. Niet Niet Nikavo. People say that her song was Niet Niet Nikavo. She was so happy for her father that he was free. That summer, the Friedrich Rebbe was contemplating whether he should leave Russia or not, and he wouldn't leave Russia without his father's permission. So at the end of the summer, he traveled to Rostov, which is in the Ukraine, to visit the Tzion, the resting place of the Rebbe Rashab, to decide whether he should leave Russia or not. He traveled with his daughter, the Rebbe Chaya Mushka. Again, an example. If you understand the nature of that trip and the danger of that trip, you appreciate how the Friedrich Rebbe appreciated who the Rebbe Chaya Mushka was. Another example. The Rebbe had a brother named Label. Label lived in Berlin together with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. I believe, I don't know if this is true, I've heard this, that Label was once beaten up by the brown shirts. When the Nazis had these brown shirts, which would later become the Gestapo and the SS. Brown shirts were basically street thugs who would go around beating people up, intimidating people so that they would vote for the Nazi party. And of course, they loved beating up on Jews. Label once did not hire Hitler, and they beat him into Mazik. They had to leave Germany. And they left Germany. Now Label decided to move on to Eretz Yisrael. But for reasons that had to do with papers, the only way he can go from France to Israel was to go back into Berlin and pick up documents which the Germans had. And he really was not looking forward to that trip. And the Rebbetzin said, I'll go for you. And the Rebbetzin went to the Rebbe's brother, came to Berlin, took care of what needed to be taken care of, and she was identified as Schneerson. Your married name is Schneerson. What's your maiden name? Schneerson. What's your mother's maiden name? Schneerson. They never heard something like this in their lives. So they said to her, when we come to Paris, we're going to look you up. And they did. They did. When the Germans came to Paris, they went to look up the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, because they didn't believe that there could be a person with the Schneerson for Nalazaiten. And the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin had literally left a day or two before. Point is, she went into the lion's jaw to help her brother-in-law, because she had that kind of poise. She had that kind of ability to keep it together under the most difficult of circumstances. She was a deep badas, and deep on a godly level, not just on a psychological level. And when there was a need, she was utilized because of the depth that she had. And the final example I'm going to give you, which is closer to us, is after the Rebbe became Rebbe. People don't know this. After the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Rebbetzin traveled a number of times. I know for a fact that she was in London on one trip. She went to see her sister-in-law. The Rebbe had a brother who passed away very, very young and left a wife and a little daughter. The Rebbetzin went to London to spend time with her sister-in-law and nephew and niece. The Rebbe also the Rebbetzin also traveled for other reasons, but one of the reasons that the Rebbetzin traveled was when Lubavitcher Hasidim came out of Russia, they were countryless, right? After the war, there were displaced persons, DPs, camps for hundreds of thousands of Jews who no longer had a country, no longer had a passport, and frankly didn't want a country, didn't want a passport. They wanted to move away and start over. So for a number of years, they were literally living on charity. Meaning to say, they were being supported by various philanthropic organizations, living in Germany and then later in France, waiting to be given immigration status to a new country. So in 1953, I think, or 52 yet, the Rebbetzin went for the Rebbe to see Anash. She went to see how Chassidim were living, and it was not comfortable living. They had these big, big houses, like palaces, old palaces that were no longer being used. Every family had a room. They shared one bathroom. It was very, very difficult. And the Rebbetzin went to see how Anash are living, and Most people would not have known who she was if they saw her. She came to Paris, as one of the people who took care of her said, she didn't need a lot of help. She knew Paris, she lived in Paris. She got around the city all by herself. She did what she needed to do, and she came to see Chassidim up close. To see and not be seen is the point. She wanted to see was machen anash, how Chassidim are doing, in the kind of a way that they would not even realize that they're being observed. She came back and reported to the Rebbe, and again, this is what people say, that when she returned from a trip, the Rebbe began to give different kinds of instructions to Anash about where they should go, whether they should move to Israel or stay in Europe, and so on. But it's an example of who she was. A very deep person who had the ability to do very, very difficult and responsible tasks, almost without being seen. And it was a reflection of her, this quality, her das. And of course, the greatest thing that Rebbetzin did in her life was give us the Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, and Hasidim were looking for a Rebbe. And of course, Hasidim wanted the Rebbe to be Rebbe, and a lot of pressure was brought to bear. But again, I was not born in 1950. My father was before his bar mitzvah, so I don't know these stories personally. But these are the stories that Hasidim relate, that the Rebbetzin said to her husband. The Rebbetzin said to the Rebbe, if you don't become Rebbe, the 30 years of Mesiras Nefesh that my father gave will end in nothing. I cannot see that the 30 years of sacrifice that my father made should end in nothing, and she encouraged the Rebbe to become Rebbe. And she bore the brunt of that. She paid the price. The Rebbetzin gave the Rebbe to Chassidim. And she did it happily. She did it completely. Completely. The Rebbetzin gave away the Rebbe to Chassidim completely. And she lived for the rest of her life, which is almost 40 years, with one goal, to make it easier for the Rebbe to Rebbe Chassidim. Mrs. Sternberg, the Langazund, who knew her very personally, relates how the Rebbetzins entire worldview was how she can maximize the amount of time the Rebbe had with Chassidim. It wasn't about her at all, which is a remarkable thing to do this for so many years. Now I'm going to share with you some anecdotes about the Rebbetzins' relation to the Rebbe that we know after the Rebbe was Rebbe, that are significant and interesting. The first, I don't remember where I heard it. I heard it relatively recently. It's powerful, and I believe it's true. I wouldn't tell you if I didn't think so, but it is a bit sensitive. That when the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka called a group of Elter Chassidim. And she said to them as follows. Traditionally, the Rebbetzins have looked after their husbands. That's what the Rebbetzin does. She takes care of the Rebbe. And she said, the Rebbetzins also told the Rebbe when to stop, when it was enough. In other words, the Rebbetzin had the role of telling the Rebbe, now you have to take care of your health, you have to stop, you have to rest, you have to eat, you have to take care of yourself. So the Rebbetzin told these Chassidim the following, I'll take care of him, but I'm not going to tell him what to do. I'm not going to stop him ever. That's your job. In other words, the Rebbetzin said that she feels prepared to take care of the Rebbe, which she did. But to tell the Rebbe when he should stop his involvement with Chassidim, she told him straight, I will not do that. And if you know anything about the Rebbe didn't take that from anybody. The Rebbe gave of himself also like no other Rebbe gave. That's number one. Number two, the Rebbe stayed in 770 very late. Very late. 3 nights a week was Yechidus. Yechidus was all night. Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and later on, by the way, it became Sunday and Thursday. The Rebbe would sit, if need be, till 7 in the morning. Start at 8 o'clock at night, the Rebbe would see people. In the summertime, he would stop at 9:30 for Ma'ariv. Otherwise, the Rebbe sat with people. As long as there were people, he sat. And people couldn't believe it. You walk to the Rebbe 3 in the morning, and he's wide awake, and he's so sharp. How come he's not tired? No one understood how come the Rebbe's never tired. The Rebbetzin sat in her house waiting for the Rebbe. Now, if there was nights that were not Yechidus, Monday, Wednesday, Motzei Shabbos, the Rebbe came home early. You know what early was? Midnight. Midnight, literally. Friday night also. The Rebbe would go home very late. The Rebbe davened Ma'ariv, went to his room. The Rebbe didn't go home right away. The Rebbe went home late. And the Rebbetzin waited for the Rebbe. Now, just to give you another aspect, when the Rebbetzin became older, and especially when the Rebbetzin was not so well, the Rebbe changed his schedule. The Rebbe started going home much earlier, like as early as 7 o'clock. There was no Yechidus in the 80s when I was growing up already. and the Rebbe went home much earlier. The Rebbe worried about the Rebbetzin also. But for 30 years, until Lamed Ches for sure, the Rebbe came home at all hours of the night. And whenever he came home, the Rebbetzin was awake. Always. And there was hot, fresh food waiting for the Rebbe. One of the great miracles of the Rebbetzin is how do you keep food hot and fresh for hour and hour and hour and hour. And you have no idea when it's going to be eaten. It's not like he gives you a half an hour notice, I'm coming home in half an hour. There was no such thing. The Rebbe just walked in. And the food was ready. And fresh. And hot. For the Rebbe to eat. Somebody once commented to the Rebbetzin, one of her friends, one of her childhood friends, that it must be so difficult for her that she has no idea when her husband is coming home and he comes home so late and so on. And the Rebbetzin was hurt by it and she snapped back. Whenever he comes home, I'm awake. Und der Essen is warm und frisch and the food is hot and warm. The idea that somehow the Rebbe was hurting the Rebbetzin was something that she didn't even want to hear. This is the kind of dedication she had. She waited for the Rebbe. Waited all night. And she was very happy to see him when he came home. Because this was her purpose. Her purpose was to give the Rebbe to Chassidim. And that when the Rebbe came home, he would have a place that was allowing the Rebbe to do what he needed to do in that environment and so on and so forth. This is an interesting story. Very interesting. The other side of the coin. I heard this from someone who doesn't exaggerate. I believe that, again, if I didn't believe the story was true, I wouldn't tell it. But I don't know. You probably don't know if a story is true unless you hear it from a very, very direct source. The Rebbe once came home and realized that the Rebbetzin had dozed off. She was sitting in a chair. She fell asleep. So he walked back to 770. Didn't want to wake her. She woke up and realized that Rebbetzin had been in the house. He was able to realize it because of the way the locks were locked or unlocked. She realized. So she immediately called 770 to find out where the Rebbe was. It's the other side of that coin. The Rebbe walked into the house and saw that the Rebbetzin had fallen asleep. She was waiting for him all night. He didn't want to wake her up. He went back to 770, which was an inconvenience. It took time and effort and so on. This is the kind of relationship they had. It's not going to happen to you. Don't worry about it. What can I tell you? If you want to have a Rebbe for a husband, you got to be a Rebbetzin for a wife. And it goes both ways, of course. I understand that the Rebbetzin was thinking about the Rebbe whole day. She would call the office all the time. One of the things the secretaries did was pick up the phone and talk to her. The Rebbetzin wanted to know what's going on. In the course of a day, she would call many times. What's going on now? What's going on now? She thought about the Rebbe every minute. From the moment he left the house till the moment he came home, which was most of the 24 hours of each day, the Rebbetzin thought about him, and she would call up every few hours to find out what's going on. This was the kind of attention. And by the way, she wasn't a nervous, paranoid kind of a lady. It was just her whole metzius was dedicated to this purpose and to this end. And of course, the story that we always tell and we always talk about that we consider so important is, how do you be a wife and a chassid? How do you do that? How do you be a Rebbe, a wife and a chassid? And of course the answer is, don't worry, you're not going to have that test. That's the answer. How do you be a wife and a chassid? And the Rebbetzin was a wife and a chassid. And of course the examples, the cases that we know of this, the most famous and the most acute is when the Rebbe had his heart attack, Tafshin Lamed Ches, and the doctors said that the Rebbe's life was in danger, and the Rebbe needed to go to a hospital, and the Rebbe refused to go to a hospital. You all know the story. The end of the story was that they promised the Rebbe that they would not move him, and then the Rebbe went to sleep. As soon as the Rebbe fell asleep, pressure was put on the Rebbetzin that she should overrule her husband and take him to the hospital against her wishes. And everybody felt that way, except for her. In other words, the biggest Hasidim, the Rebbe's personal secretaries, felt that the Rebbe should be overruled and be taken to the hospital while he slept. And the Rebbe said, you told the Rebbe you're not going to move him. And they said, but it's best for the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, you can't do this to the Rebbe. You can't lie to him. You told me we're not moving him. And they had an argument, and she finally put it to rest with the famous words, was mein Mann will ich. What my husband wants, I want. Conversation over. There's no, you don't tell the Rebbe something and then twist his arm. Was mein Mann will ich. She was the only one who was in that room who said, you can't do this you can't play with the Rebbe. You told him something, you're going to keep your word. Which is amazing. Who cared about the Rebbe's physical health more than she did? But she understood that for the Rebbe's physical health and for everything else, you cannot trick him. You told him you're going to let him stay in the house. He's staying in the house. And the Rebbetzin understood quite well the dangers. And she said, no. You're not moving him against his wishes. And that moment showed what it means to be a wife and a chassid. A wife, totally dedicated to her husband and takes care of him physically, and at the same time says, this man, you don't play games. You told him you're going to do something, you do what you say, you don't play around. And of course, the second time when Hasidim saw the dedication that the Rebbe had to the Rebbe and her Chassidus was during the Pasha of the Sfarim. This is the closest the Rebbetzin came to being public. The Rebbetzin was so involved in the Sfarim story, the Sfarim saga, or the Sfarim fiasco, which was so difficult for her. It was her sister. It was her nephew, and she loved them very much. She really loved them very much. And she didn't stop loving them ever. And at the same time, she stood with the Rebbe, and it became clear. You read the stories and you listen to the people who were involved. They were a team. The Rebbe wasn't supporting the Rebbe. They were partners. This issue was their issue. And it was as much her purpose that the Sfarim should be the way the Rebbe wanted them as it was the Rebbe's purpose. And she was like a rock. I once heard from Yudel Krinsky, that they wanted to depose the Rebbetzin. Ask her questions. And I'm sure you've seen the film. And the purpose of deposing a person, of asking questions was, you ask the same questions over and over and over and over and over again, and you dreh a mensch up until they slip. And they say the wrong thing, and then you jump on it. And they did that to the Rebbetzin for 4 hours. And Yudel was nervous. So he said to the Rebbe, they interviewed the Rebbetzin, and the Rebbe said, don't worry. I think these were the words exactly. She'll pass with flying colors. And she did. They tried every way to fadrein it. The whole thing is trying to catch a person on a vavot. They say one word and then you jump on it. And they tried for 2 hours to exhaust her. And the end of it all was, as you've seen the film, if you haven't seen the film, you've heard the tape, but I saw the film once myself. Mrs. Schneer said, one more time, in your opinion, to whom did the books belong? And she says in what is a very exhausted voice, you can hear that she's tired. They've just used her up for 4 hours. The books belong to the Hasidim because my father belonged to the Hasidim. And in the side of the frame, you see the lawyer throwing his pencil down on the table in disgust and frustration because he didn't get anything out of her. And this is, like I said to you, the closest that Rebbetzin came to being public. And we saw the dedication, the loyalty that Rebbetzin had to the Rebbe. But there's so much more, but we don't have time. But I'll just say one thing. The Rebbetzin, I know this from a number of people, had the ability to have a one-way conversation. Many people knew her. Many people talked to her. She was incredibly engaging, incredibly personable, incredibly concerned. But it was like she didn't exist. She never talked about herself. And she never let you go there. She manipulated. She was a princess. She was a queen. She wasn't the same as the people she talked to. But she was never part of the conversation. It was all about you and your family and your friends and so on. She was never a part of the conversation. Never. It's remarkable. It's an amazing thing to be so warm and so available at the same time so private. So, and another thing about the Rebbetzin was she talked to you about what she wanted. I know a lady who said to me she wanted to talk about the Rebbetzin about politics. She wanted to talk to the Rebbetzin about ideas, and the Rebbetzin just didn't want to discuss it with her. So the Rebbetzin talked to her about fashion. She said to me, I was disappointed. All she cared about was fashion. And of course, that's a foolish statement. That's all she discussed with you was fashion, because that's where she was going to go with you. That's how she was. If she didn't want to go to a certain place with you, you didn't go there. And she managed her conversations with that very, very subtle das that I described before, with few words and nuance. You could not take her to a place you didn't want to go in a conversation. This is a true story, I believe. Again, I think the story was written by somebody who personally, it happened with them and they knew the Rebbetzin personally. There was a conversation about something. I don't know if it was politics or it was something. And the Rebbetzin knew everything. She was very, very smart. She was the Friedrich Rebbe's daughter. That's pretty good IQ. Brilliant. She knew so much about so many things. Maybe she didn't discuss it with you, but that didn't mean she didn't know it. Maybe she didn't discuss it with you. She was having a conversation with somebody about something, and she said her opinion. And she had strong opinions. So somebody at the table said to her, the Rebbe said by Fabringen different. So she repeated herself and said what her husband said. So they said to her, Rebbetzin, you said 60 seconds ago different. And she said, this is my opinion. And she said it like a shneerson. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get angry. But you knew there's no point in asking the question again. The Rebbetzin was told that the Rebbe had a different view on a subject, and it became hers. It wasn't an act. It wasn't an act. It wasn't to impress you. It wasn't to keep the peace in the Lubavitch. It was the kind of relationship she had with the Rebbe. If this is what the Rebbe thought, this is what she thought. And she understood it. In other words, she didn't only change her conclusion, she went through in her head the re-rationalization and said, okay, if this is correct, then I understand this to be correct. This is the kind of respect she had for the Rebbe. And of course, the story that everybody tells, and there's many versions of it. Recently, Jem gave out a series of interviews with a Yid who was the Rebetzin's podiatrist, the Rebetzin's foot doctor. And you see this guy with a beard and payas and a yarmulke. The first time he came to the Rebbetzin, he didn't put on a yarmulke. He had long hair. He was a single guy, not from at all. And you should probably seen the interviews with him, how the Rebbetzin asked him if he's married, and he said he's not. And the Rebbetzin asked him if he's dating, and he said he is. And the Rebbetzin said, you're probably dating Jewish girls. And he said, I hate Jewish girls. I only date chicks. And how the Rebbetzin very gently navigated him in a direction where he should reconsider his hatred for Jewish girls, and he should start dating Jewish girls. And the Rebbetzin said, we'll see what'll be. And the guy ended up getting married when he was 40. And he's a frum wife, beautiful mishpacha, beautiful story, which I don't have time to tell you, but I just want to tell you this. This man, you watch him interview, I don't know how to say it. He said things to the Rebbetzin that he shouldn't have said. But one of the things he said to the Rebbetzin was, he tells the story himself. I was sitting with the Rebbetzin, I said to her, you're such an incredibly sensitive person. You're such a warm person. It's such a pity you never had children. You would have made a great mother. And the Rebbetzin looked at him in shock. Because that's really an insensitive thing to say. It's not a nice thing to say. It's not. You don't say that to a woman who's 80 years old. I'm sorry you never had kids. Thank you very much. But he told it to her, and she looked at him like, I can't believe you said that, And then he said that she saw that I wasn't meddling. I meant it. So she softened, and she said, my children are in 770. And she said this to many people. The story with her nephews, right? The Rebbetzin had two nephews. The Rebbetzin had a niece. The Rebbe had a brother who had a daughter who had two sons, and they lived in Washington. They were the Rebbe's niece and nephew were members of the delegation of the Israeli government to Washington, D.C. And in fact, this is just a little anecdote. During the time that they were there, their second son was born, and the Rebbe sent them an entire minyan for a bris, including Spitz Chabad. He sent Rabbi Chadakov himself to Washington to participate in their bris. This is how the Rebbe felt about his nephews. They were also royalty to the Rebbe. And they would visit. They would come to the house. They would visit. And of course, the Rebbe went out and bought toys. The Rebbe bought toys. This is how she was. She thought about everybody and everything. She bought toys for the kids to play with. And the kids came to the house. They saw all these new toys. They played with them. And then they turned to her and they said, if you have toys, you must have kids. Where are the kids? And the Rebbetzin said, my children are in 770. Now I want to say one more thing. This is the end of my talk. And this to me is very important. And I want to share this with you, even though I'm a man and you're girls. This is what I want to tell you. The source of my information is mostly from interviews that were done by a lady named Mrs. Hager from London. You may have met her, you may know her, you may have seen her interviews. She teaches something about the Rebbetzin, which I think is very important for girls, especially in this generation, to appreciate. I've already tried to describe to you how secret the Rebbetzin was, and how she gave you of herself what she chose. She managed all of her relationships. That's what you do when you're a queen. That's what you do when you're a queen. You can't just, it's not America where you just hang out all your emotions. But she had different relationships with different people. And what I learned from listening to Mrs. Hager speak is that a lot of the conversations that Rebbetzin had were actually her teaching. It was never done as instruction. The Rebbetzin wasn't giving lessons. But the people she knew, and the people she was involved with, and the conversations she had with them, if you think about them in hindsight, she wasn't just chatting. She wasn't just showing an interest and a concern. She was educating. And I found this very, very important. And what was her message to women? What was her message to women? The women who knew her personally, the girls who she met. And this is what Mrs. Hager explains, and I think it's very important to appreciate. And once you hear her tell the story, all the other stories you hear about all the other women that Rebbetzin knew and how she talked to them, it all starts to make much more sense. The Rebbetzin was teaching women how beautiful it is to be a woman. And being a woman means taking care of your house. Being a woman means taking care of your husband. Being a woman means taking care of your children. And get all the stories you want. And there are many people, many women who did Rebbetzin. She always talked to the women about their clothing being nice. She wanted to know where they shopped and what they bought. And she would make comments. Not just about the clothes the women were wearing, but the clothes they bought for their children. She talked about cooking. You know, that she once complained that Rebbetzin said, I grew up in a royal house, I never learned how to cook. And it's a shud. If I learned how to cook, I would make better food for my husband. She was constantly teaching women what Mrs. Hager calls the lessons of domesticity. You know, we live in the age of madness. This is a crazy world. We're just all cuckoo. And we're all voluntarily carrying around the cuckoo in our pocket called the smartphone that makes us all stupid. It's tragic. Tragic. It's unbelievable. It's a very, very sad generation. It's very, very sad. It's unfortunate. It's life. We got to deal with it. Maybe she gave us these instructions. We got to deal with them and whatever. But when 30 years ago, those were pretty nuts. Not as crazy as today, but plenty crazy. And part of that is women's liberation. You know, what liberated women? Does anybody know what liberated women? So, of course, what do you guys know? You're little, yeah? I was a kid in the 70s. The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, made liberated women. And women were going to be like everybody else, so on and so forth. What liberated women, to be very honest, is such benign things as the freezer, the refrigerator, the washing machine, the dishwasher, the electric iron. No, this is true. A woman spent a whole day and a whole night taking care of her house. And now machines are doing 80% of that. So what's she going to do with her time? She's going to go on the street and protest, I want to be like men. I'm sorry for breaking it down that way, but it's actually pretty precise. And, you know, Lubavitcher girls, I have a grandmother, she wasn't a Lubavitcher. She said, Lubavitcher girls were never imprisoned, they didn't need to be liberated. My grandmother was not a Lubavitcher. And she loved Lubavitchers. And she loved what she saw in my sisters. Lubavitcher girls are liberated. But Lubavitcher girls are not boys. They're girls. And they will be women. And they'll be mothers. And they're going to be wives. I should say it the other way. They're going to be wives and they're going to be mothers. And the Rebbetzin was teaching them this lesson every chance she got. And when I hear these stories, I look back at it in hindsight. And remember, this is me telling you how I feel and giving you my opinion. That's all this is. But the Rebbetzin spent so much time talking to every lady she knew about being a wife and being a mother, because the Rebbetzin understood how much it's uncool to do those things in the modern world. And she wanted to make it cool. She wanted girls who were college educated. I'm not trying to advocate college, but Mrs. Hager is a college educated woman, to appreciate that the old-fashioned values of looking after your husband, that's what a woman does. The old-fashioned values of a woman taking care of her children, and her home has to be beautiful and has to be a home. A home is not a museum. A home, people live, and things spill, and accidents happen, and it has that warmth, and it has that sense of peace and harmony. She was constantly teaching this to women and girls, because she wanted them to learn this lesson. And Mrs. Hager says in her interviews, you can see her speak, it wasn't natural to her. She was a liberated girl. She grew up in the 70s, when women were saying, you know what the Rebbe said about women's liberation. Women's liberation is a very appropriate idea. It's a logical idea, it's a legitimate idea, it's a true idea. But what is women's liberation? The freedom of a woman to be a woman. And the reality of women's liberation, it was the freedom of women to be a man. How sad is that? How tragic is that? How foolish is that? And this is what happened in the 70s. Women decided the way to be liberated is to be like men. And this, I think, if, in other words, I told you when I started my talk, I don't want this to be a bunch of stories, because it's just a waste of time to tell stories. If there's a lesson that I could leave you with, which I know you need to hear, it's this. Get those tapes. Listen to Mrs. Hager tell her story about her relationship with the Rebbetzin. There's a clip. She spoke from the Sheikh Chabad 2 years after the Rebbetzin passed away. She's a shy lady. She's a queen herself. She's a regal woman. But she's not a public person. It was very difficult for her. She wrote her speech down word for word. She sent it into the Rebbe to edit before she gave her talk. It was the first time somebody who knew the Rebbetzin well spoke about her publicly. And she asked the Rebbe permission. And the Rebbe encouraged her to talk about the Rebbetzin, encouraged her to talk about the Rebbetzin. And there's a clip of her walking by the Rebbe for dollars after her talk. And she says to the Rebbe, I spoke about the Rebbetzin, and I hope I honored her, I hope I did what would have been appropriate for her. And I forget the exact wording, but the spirit of it is, the Rebbe says, and I hope you learned the lessons that she taught you. So she says, yes, to take care of my family. And the Rebbe says to her, to take care of your husband. And she says, yes, first I take care of my husband. I think I'm giving it to you correctly. I think I'm repeating accurately. But there's so much in those few seconds. Because the Rebbe said to her, what did my wife teach you? That of course you can have a career and you can be a shlucha and you can save the world. You're first of all a wife and a mother. But she says to the Rebbe, a mother. And the Rebbe says to her, a wife. Before you look after your children, look after your husband. How weird is that, huh? How much is that a part of how you think? You're in a different generation. This is what the Rebbetzin is teaching. Forgive me for saying it. The Rebbetzin is teaching this to you. And she wants you to learn these lessons. These are Jewish lessons. These are timeless lessons. These are real lessons. You don't become a less of a person when you look after your husband. You become more of a person. You don't become less of a person when you make the number one priority in your life your children. You become more of a person. And if there's anything that you could say that Rebbetzin taught, more than anything else to the people she knew, it was this lesson. And if Chav Shevat has meaning, and like I said, we don't want to think about the Rebbetzin. We don't begin to understand what it means to be a Rebbetzin. I mean, there are stories about the Rebbetzin. Dr. Feldman said once, Boston Yeshiva, he said, I can tell you as a matter of fact that the Rebbetzin had Ruach HaKodesh. He said she knew things that there's no way she knew. The Rebbetzin never walked around in the streets. Never. Never. She didn't come to shul. Ever. Sie sich nicht gedreht. Dr. Feldman was a family practitioner in Crown Heights, which meant that, let's say, on average, half the Lubavitch Brachas Crown Heights went to him for medical treatment. And in a film community, you have thousands of kids. Thousands of kids. The Rebbetzin knew every child by name. And every child who went to his office for whatever she knew. And she would ask him questions. How did she know? How? How did she know? The Rebbe came home and gave her a list of all the Misha Berachs. The Rebbetzin was a holy lady. There's things about it we can't understand. And if you noticed, I didn't tell a single miracle story that I avoided all of that. I gave you a simple talk. I didn't tell you the stories that I have. A lot of good stories that I could have told you. I want you to take away this. I really want you to think about this. That if there's a lesson that the Rebbetzin left for Jewish women, is I'm old-fashioned, and the Rebbetzin was very modern. But I'm old-fashioned. I take care of my husband. My home, the Rebbetzin home, was very simple. The Rebbetzin lived, I would say, almost on a poverty level. They had a big house, which didn't belong to them. It belonged to Americans, and they lived so simply. But the Rebbetzin took care of it. The Rebbetzin once told a friend of hers that they were living in a room in Vichy, in the south of France, when they ran away from the Nazis. They didn't have any furniture. So they had these trunks, these big old suitcases, these heavy trunks. And she opened them up, and she arranged the clothing in the trunks like as if it were a drawer. It should look pretty. So that when you walked into the room, you felt like there was something homey about it. You understand? She was very sensitive to be a balabosta. And she wasn't lavish. She was not someone who needed a lot. But she wanted to do what a wife and a mother are supposed to do. And I think, above all else, this is a lesson that you could take from her. And if it's hard for you to learn this lesson, I understand that. But hard doesn't mean wrong. Hard means this is part of what you need to do. You know, you're going to be a wife. You're going to be a mother. Those things are what the Rebbetzin is teaching you are the most important lessons in your life. If you can learn those lives, it means Hashem, you'll have more happiness and more success and more brachas, not only in being a wife and a mother, but all the incredible things that girls do today. And we should say to the Gula Shleima, and we'll see the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin one more time. Okay, good Shabbos.